Ever get that feeling? Like you're trying to understand something big, something really important, but it's just overwhelming. Too much information, too many rabbit holes, you know?
Right, yeah, you just want to cut through the noise, get to the heart of it all.
Exactly. Well, that's kind of the whole idea behind this. We call it the deep dive. Basically, your shortcut to understanding. We take complex stuff, your stuff actually, you send us some amazing material, and we break it down, make it digestible, fun even, hopefully.
And today's deep dive,
Yeah.
we're tackling the narrow corridor. States, societies, liberty, the whole shebang. You sent over some really thought-provoking excerpts, gotta say.
Oh, for sure. And the goal today is, well, to really grapple with this idea of liberty, right? What does it actually mean? And then the big one. How much power should a government have? Too little, too much? What's the sweet spot for societies to actually thrive?
Okay, so first things first, I think it's helpful to start with a really clear understanding of what liberty means in this context.
Yeah, totally. Because it can get kind of abstract, right? You get lost in the philosophy of it all.
Exactly. But the book, The Narrow Corridor, it actually gives us a really practical starting point. It says, forget all those fancy theories for a second. Think about it like this. At its most basic, liberty is about being free from violence, from intimidation, from anything that demeans you, prevents you from making your own choices.
So not just some vague ideal, but something very real, like your day-to-day existence, right?
Yes.
You feel safe, you can make decisions about your life without someone constantly looking over your shoulder.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's about having that actual space to live your life the way you want, to the extent that that's possible. But here's where it gets really interesting. The book argues that simply getting rid of a strong government, that doesn't automatically equal this kind of liberty.
Ah, so it's not as simple as less government, more freedom.
Not necessarily, no. And the examples you shared, they really drive this point home. Take Syria, for example. After the protests in Damascus, the whole country kind of spiraled into civil war. In many places, the state, the army, the police, they basically collapsed. People thought, okay, freedom at last. But what happened?
Yeah, what did happen? It wasn't some utopia of peace and freedom, was it?
Not even close. It was chaos. It was violence on a huge scale. The state, that strong central authority, what they call the Leviathan, it was gone. But that didn't create a vacuum of liberty. It created a vacuum of order. And that void, it was filled with something much, much worse.
So, first takeaway, no government doesn't necessarily mean more freedom. It can actually mean way less.
Yeah, and the thing is, Syria, that's not some isolated incident. The material you sent, it suggests that stateless societies, they're not these peaceful paradises. They're often incredibly violent.
Really? Even without a government, you're telling me there's still tons of violence.
Yep. Archaeologists, they've been looking at, skeletal remains from these societies, and they're finding evidence of constant warfare, lots of violent deaths. And it's not just ancient history either. Anthropologists who study these societies that still exist today, they're seeing the same thing.
Huh. That's surprising. I guess we tend to romanticize these societies, right? Like simpler times, more peaceful, all that.
Right. But the data just doesn't back that up. Back in the 70s, this researcher, Carol Ember, she did this big study on hunter-gatherer societies. And guess what? They were constantly at war, like a war every other year on average. Crazy, right?
Yeah, that's a lot of war. So yeah, the whole less government, less conflict thing, definitely not a guarantee.
Not at all. And the death rates, they're shocking. The book mentions like over 500 deaths per 100,000 people just from war and murder. Imagine you've got a 1 in 4 chance of dying violently in your lifetime. That's intense.
Oh, I can't even wrap my head around that. And it wasn't just conflict between different groups either, right? Like, what about violence within a community?
Oh, yeah, that happened too. The Gabusi people in New Guinea, they're a really stark example. They had a murder rate even higher than 500 per 100,000.
Yeah.
And much of this violence, it wasn't even during war. It was during what you'd consider peaceful times.
Wow. So even without a state, without a formal government, there's still this potential for huge amounts of violence. But why?
Well, in the Gabusi case, it seems to be tied to this belief in witchcraft. They believed every death, it was caused by witchcraft, which meant someone had to be punished. So you had these cycles of revenge, ongoing violence, even when there was no formal war going on.
So beliefs, social norms, they can be just as powerful as a government in terms of, well, controlling people's behavior, even violently.
Yeah, and this is where the book introduces a really interesting idea. The cage of norms.
The cage of norms. What's that?
Basically, think of it like this. Even without a formal state, without laws and police, you can still be trapped. Not by bars, but by social expectations. unwritten rules. You step out of line, and there are consequences.
So it's not just about the chaos of having no rules, it's about the potential oppression of having really strict, unwritten rules.
Exactly. The book uses this Asante proverb. It says, if there is no one to stop the hawk, it will constantly prey on the chickens. Meaning, social norms alone, they might not be enough to prevent some people from dominating others.
I get it. Like, even without a formal government, you can still have bullies, you can still have inequality, all because of these deeply ingrained social norms.
Right. And these unwritten rules, they can be really rigid. Take societies where kinship, family ties, that's the main organizing principle, that can provide support, sure, but it can also trap you. Like if someone wrongs your family, you're expected to retaliate. Blood feuds, revenge killings, that kind of thing.
So without a strong state, without a legal system that's impartial, those social norms, they can actually perpetuate violence. It's like the law of the jungle, but within a community.
Yeah, exactly. There's these examples in the book, like Draco's homicide law in ancient Athens, or the Albanian Kanun, this set of traditional laws. Both of them, they show how informal laws, enforced by families, could lead to these long, drawn-out cycles of violence. You wrong someone's family, and the feud can go on for generations.
So, no Leviathan, no state. That doesn't necessarily mean freedom. It just means a different kind of unfreedom, one dictated by social pressures, by these really powerful norms. But then, does that mean a strong state is the answer? Like, a powerful government can solve all these problems?
Well, that's the next big question, right? And the book argues that, well, it's not that simple. A strong state, a Leviathan, it's absolutely necessary to control violence, to provide some degree of order, but unchecked state power, what they call the despotic Leviathan, that can be just as bad, if not worse, for individual liberty.
So it's not just about how strong the state is, but how that power is used, how it's controlled.
Right. And the book uses this example of women's rights to illustrate this. In the UAE, for example, many rights for women, they were granted by the sheikh, the ruler. It was top-down, not really driven by society itself. And the book argues that, as a result, those rights might be less secure, less deeply rooted in society.
Interesting. Compared to places where those rights were fought for, demanded by the people themselves.
Exactly. Like the suffragettes in Britain. They didn't just wait for the government to give them the right to vote. They organized, they protested, they did all sorts of things to force the government's hand. Bombings, chaining themselves to railings, hunger strikes, the whole 9 yards.
Wow, so they weren't messing around. They really put pressure on the state to change.
They did. And the point is, writes, they're often more secure when they're won through struggle, through societal pressure. It's not enough to have them written down in a constitution. Society has to be actively involved in claiming them, in defending them.
Okay, so a strong state isn't automatically a good thing. It really depends on how that power is used, whether there are limits, whether the people have a say. And the book, it uses this really chilling example to illustrate this. Nazi Germany.
Right. The Nazi regime, that was a powerful state, no doubt. A bureaucratic machine that could get things done and force its will. But it was a state that used its power for horrific ends. Persecution, oppression, mass murder.
So a perfect example of a despotic leviathan, a state that's strong, efficient, but also utterly terrifying. And the book, it quotes this philosopher, Heidegger, who said something like, the Führer, Hitler, he embodies the law. Like, that's how powerful the state had become.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. And it shows that a strong state doesn't equal a free society. What matters is whether that power is controlled, whether there are checks and balances.
Okay, so we've seen the dangers of both extremes. No Leviathan, total chaos. Despotic Leviathan, total control. So where's the middle ground? Where's the sweet spot?
That's where this idea of the narrow corridor comes in.
The narrow corridor. So what is it, this corridor? Some kind of magical pathway?
Not magical, but definitely delicate. It's this space, this very specific balance between state and society. Both have to be strong enough to keep each other in check. The state needs enough power to provide order, but society needs enough power to make sure that power isn't abused.
So it's not just about the state being strong, but about society being strong too. And they kind of, push against each other, keep each other in line?
Exactly. It's this constant back and forth, this tension that the book calls the Red Queen effect, like in Alice in Wonderland, remember? The Red Queen says you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. It's kind of what it's like in this corridor. State and society, they're constantly pushing, adapting just to maintain that balance.
Wow. So liberty, it's not some static thing, some endpoint you reach. It's this constant process, this struggle to stay within this very specific zone.
Right. And the question is, why do so many societies, why do they end up outside this corridor? What makes it so hard to find that balance, to stay within those lines?
Good question. Is it just bad luck? Or are there like patterns, reasons why some societies struggle more than others?
The book, it offers a few explanations. One thing is the nature of societal power itself. Like in societies struggling with the absent Leviathan, they might have these norms, these traditions that are really good at preventing, one person or group from becoming too powerful at a local level.
Okay, so like checks and balances, but on a small scale.
Right. But the problem is those norms, those traditions, they don't always translate well to a national level. They might be great at preventing a small-town dictator, but not so great at controlling a national government.
Ah, I see. It's like you've got these rules for a neighborhood game, but they don't quite work when you're playing on a national stage.
Exactly. And then there's this other thing. How much does the state know about its people? How legible is society to the state?
Legible? You mean like how much information the government has about its citizens?
Right. Things like censuses, counting everyone, figuring out where they live, what they do. That can be really helpful for a state. It lets them provide services, make sure everyone's represented fairly.
Okay, so some level of legibility is good, but too much and it gets creepy, right? Big brother, all that.
Exactly. And the book uses this example of Lebanon. They haven't had a census since the 30s because there's this deep mistrust of the state. People are afraid that information will be used against them.
So the state needs information to function, but society needs to trust the state not to abuse that information. It's a tricky balance.
Yeah, it is. And the book argues that, getting into this corridor, it's not just about building a strong state, it's about building a strong society too. The society that's engaged, organized, and yes, that trusts the state to some degree.
So it's not just about laws and institutions, it's about the culture, the values of a society. Like, do people believe in participating in government? Do they believe in holding leaders accountable?
Exactly. And the journey into the corridor, it's not a one-time thing. It's a constant process and evolution. You're constantly adjusting, adapting, trying to find that sweet spot.
Okay, so we've talked about the theory, the big ideas, but what about real-world examples? Like, how have societies actually navigated this corridor?
Right. Let's get into the specifics. The book looks at all sorts of historical examples, like the early Islamic state under Muhammad.
Oh, wait, so how does that fit into this whole corridor thing?
Well, before Islam, you had these tribal societies in Arabia,
Mm.
lots of conflict, feuding, the classic absent Leviathan problem. But Muhammad, when he came along, he established a new system, a unified religious and political order.
So he essentially created a state, a Leviathan, where there wasn't one before.
Exactly. And that brought a degree of order, a way to resolve disputes, a way to reduce violence. So you could argue that, in that context, it was a step towards the corridor.
Okay, so creating a state can be a good thing, especially if it brings stability, reduces violence. But the book then contrasts Muhammad with another state builder, Shaka Zulu.
Right, Shaka, he was this incredibly powerful leader who united the Zulu tribes in South Africa. But he did it through military might, through conquest.
Yeah.
He created a strong army, a powerful state, but he wasn't really concerned with, individual rights or limiting his own power.
So a classic case of a strong state, but not necessarily a free one. He went from absent Leviathan to despotic Leviathan pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And it shows that just having a state, that's not enough. It's about how that state is built, how it interacts with society, whether there are checks on its power.
And the book also talks about these Polynesian concepts of mana and tapu, right? Like,
Yeah.
how does that fit into this whole picture?
Well, those concepts, they basically deal with spiritual power and social restrictions. And in Hawaii, for example, they evolved into this system called kapu, where chiefs, they were seen as having this divine power, this mana. And they used the kapu system to enforce their authority, to basically restrict what ordinary people could do.
Ah, so these pre-existing ideas about power, about social hierarchy, they shaped how the state developed.
Right. It wasn't just about a state imposing its will. It was about using these existing beliefs, these cultural norms, to legitimize and strengthen that state power.
So it seems like the starting point matters, right? Like what kind of social norms, what kind of beliefs about power already exist in a society?
Absolutely. And the book then points to ancient Athens as a more positive example. They had these formal institutions, councils, assemblies, that were designed to limit the power of any one person. They even had this practice called ostracism, where they could vote to exile someone who was becoming too powerful.
Wow, talk about checks and balances. They literally kicked people out if they got too big for their britches.
Exactly. And the point is, they didn't just rely on informal norms, on social pressure. They actually created formal mechanisms to control power, to prevent tyranny. And the book argues that without these kinds of institutions, without these societal checks, it's really hard to build a state that's both strong and free.
Okay, so we've talked about the dangers of both extremes, no state and too much state. We've looked at historical examples of how societies have tried to find that balance. But what about the economic side of things? Like, how does this whole corridor idea play out in terms of, wealth, prosperity, all that?
Right, the book gets into that too. And it argues that, well, being outside the corridor, whether you're dealing with an absent Leviathan or a despotic Leviathan, it's usually bad news for the economy.
Okay, so no state, no economy. Too much state, also no economy.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that, but basically, yeah. For the absent Leviathan, the book uses these examples of the Tonga and the Tiv people. The Tonga, they had this practice of enforced generosity. Basically, you had to give away a lot of your wealth, because if you didn't, people might think you were using sorcery to get rich.
Wow, so fear of witchcraft, that actually shaped their economic system.
It did. And the Tiv, they had this thing called salve, this mystical force that was associated with wealth. But if you had too much salve, people might think you were a witch, and they might try to kill you. So their economy, it was very restricted. People were afraid to accumulate wealth, afraid to stand out.
So in both cases, these social norms, these beliefs, they essentially prevented any real economic growth.
Right. They prioritized social harmony, preventing inequality, but at the cost of economic development. And then you have the despotic Leviathan, where the state is strong, but it often uses its power for its own benefit at the expense of the people.
So classic corruption, right? Leaders enriching themselves while the economy suffers.
Yeah, the book mentions this scholar, Ibn Khaldun, who had this theory about cycles of despotism. He said that, a new dynasty, a new ruler, they might start off well, they might bring some prosperity, but as they consolidate their power, they tend to become more and more oppressive, their policies become more and more extractive.
So the economy booms at first, but then it crashes as the ruler becomes more and more greedy.
Right, and he uses all these examples from Iraq, Egypt, all over the place to show how this pattern repeats itself.
So Ibn Khaldun, he was basically saying power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
And the book, it gives us a more recent example, Kamehameha in Hawaii. He unified the islands, but he also monopolized the sandalwood trade, basically controlled all the exports, and used that wealth to enrich himself and his allies.
So another case of a ruler using state power to control the economy to line his own pockets. But the book also talks about these Italian communes, right? Like, were they an example of getting this balance right?
Yeah, the communes, they're a really interesting example. They were these independent city-states in Italy, and they had these systems of self-governance. They elected their own leaders. They had their own laws, their own courts.
So basically mini republics within Italy.
Right. And they were able to achieve a degree of economic prosperity, partly because they had these institutions that limited the power of any one person or group. They also had these strong social norms that discouraged, excessive ambition.
So they had this combination of formal and informal checks and balances, which allowed them to create a more stable and prosperous environment.
Exactly. And the book contrasts them with, the classic image of a bad government, where you have a ruler who's just interested in enriching himself, who doesn't care about the people. And it shows that when you have that kind of government, the economy suffers.
So good governance, good economy. Bad governance, bad economy. Seems pretty straightforward.
It is, in a way. But the book then goes on to talk about this thing called the European scissors. It's this idea that in Europe, you had this unique historical development where both the state and society became stronger over time.
Okay, so both blades of the scissors getting sharper, so to speak.
Right. And as the state became more capable, able to collect taxes, enforce laws, provide services, society also became more organized, more able to demand accountability from the state.
So they kind of grew together, pushing each other, but in a good way.
Exactly. And the book argues that this dynamic, this European scissors effect, it was crucial for the eventual emergence of these more liberal, more democratic societies in Europe.
Okay, so that's Europe. But what about the rest of the world? Like China, for example. They have a very different history, right?
They do. And the book argues that In China, the focus has always been on a strong state, a centralized authority. They had this philosopher, Shang Yang, who basically said the goal is a rich state and a strong army.
So not so much about individual liberty, more about order, stability, power.
Right. And that philosophy, it shaped Chinese history for centuries. You had these powerful dynasties like the Ming and the Qing that were really good at controlling their populations, at maintaining order, but they weren't exactly known for, protecting individual rights.
So another example of a despotic leviathan, a powerful state, but not necessarily a benevolent one.
Exactly. And even the systems that were supposed to promote, social mobility, like the imperial examination system, they ultimately served to reinforce the power of the state. You had this elite class of scholar officials who owed their position to the emperor, to the bureaucracy.
So even when they tried to create a more meritocratic system, it still ended up strengthening the state, not society.
Right. And the book argues that despite all the changes China has gone through, that basic pattern, that dominance of the state over society, it's remained remarkably consistent.
Wow, so a very different trajectory than Europe. And what about India? They had this whole caste system, right? Like, how did that affect their development?
Yeah, the caste system, that's a whole other layer of complexity. Basically, it's a rigid social hierarchy determined by birth. And it's been around for centuries, shaping Indian society in profound ways.
So you're born into a certain caste, and that determines your whole life, your job, your social status, everything.
Pretty much, yeah. And the book argues that this system, it made it really hard for people to organize to challenge authority. Because you're not just divided by class, by wealth, you're divided by this whole other system that's incredibly hard to break out of.
So a cage of norms, but on a much grander scale. It's like the cage is built into the very fabric of society.
Exactly. And it made it really hard for India to develop a strong, centralized state because society itself was so fragmented.
Okay, so we've looked at Europe, China, India. What about some more recent examples? Like, how are countries navigating this corridor today?
Right. So the book talks about this concept of the paper leviathan. It's basically a state that looks strong on paper. It's got all the institutions, the bureaucracy, but it doesn't really function.
So a government that's all show, no substance.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's common in a lot of post-colonial countries where the state was basically imposed from the outside. It doesn't have deep roots in society.
So the state exists, but it's weak, corrupt, inefficient. And what about the people? Do they have any power to change things?
Not really. Often these paper leviathans, they're afraid of societal mobilization, of people demanding more rights, more accountability. So they try to suppress any kind of dissent, any kind of organized opposition.
So a vicious cycle. The state is weak, but it's also afraid of its own people, so it becomes even weaker, even more dysfunctional.
Exactly. And the book uses all these examples like Guatemala, Colombia, to show how this plays out in the real world. It's a real problem. Because without a functioning state, you can't really have liberty. You can't have development.
So we need a state, but we need the right kind of state. A state that's strong, but also accountable, that respects the rights of its citizens.
Right. And the book then points to some more positive examples like the changes that have been happening in Lagos, Nigeria. They had this period of intense anarchy, but they're slowly starting to build a more functional state, a more responsive government.
So there's hope, even in places that have been through really tough times.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's this example of Bogota, Colombia. They had this mayor who basically said, enough is enough. He reformed the city government, strengthened the executive branch, weakened these corrupt political machines that were running the show.
So he basically took on the system, and he won.
He did. And it shows that even in places with a long history of corruption, of dysfunction, change is possible. It takes leadership, it takes courage, but it can be done.
So what are the big takeaways here? Like, if we're trying to build a better world, a world where liberty actually flourishes, what do we need to focus on?
Well, first, I think we need to recognize that liberty, it's not some abstract concept, some pie-in-the-sky ideal. It's about concrete things, like being free from violence, being able to make your own choices, having a say in how you're governed.
Right, so it's about real-world conditions, not just lofty rhetoric.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
second, we need to understand that the state, the government, it's a powerful tool. It can be used for good or for evil. It can be used to protect liberty, or it can be used to crush it.
So it's not about big government versus small government. It's about the right kind of government. A government that's strong enough to provide order, but that's also constrained by law, by institutions, by a vigilant and active society.
Right. And third, I think we need to remember that this is a constant struggle. Liberty, it's not something you achieve once and then it's done. It's something you have to fight for, to defend every single day.
So eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, as they say.
Yeah, I think that about sums it up.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. I feel like I have a much better understanding of this whole narrow corridor concept now.
Me too. And I think the really important thing is to take these ideas, these insights, and apply them to the world around us, to look at our own societies, our own governments, and ask ourselves, are we moving towards that corridor or away from it?
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, what can we do as individuals, as citizens, to make sure we're on the right path?
I think the book gives us some clues. It emphasizes the importance of societal mobilization, of people organizing, of demanding accountability from their leaders. It talks about the importance of building strong institutions, of having a robust civil society, of fostering a culture that values both individual rights and collective responsibility.
So it's not just about waiting for someone else to fix things, it's about taking action ourselves.
Exactly. And I think that's a really empowering message. We have the power to shape our own destiny, to create societies that are both free and just. But it takes work, it takes commitment, and it takes a willingness to speak up, to stand up for what we believe in.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought. The book ends with this really powerful poem by Martin Niemöller. It's about the dangers of silence, of not speaking out against injustice. And I think it's a really fitting reminder, especially in these times.
Absolutely. Niemöller's words serve as a timeless reminder that we must never allow ourselves to become complacent, to turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. Because when we do, when we choose silence over action, we become complicit in the erosion of those very freedoms that we hold dear. Liberty is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation, a willingness to stand up for what is right, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it as enlightening and thought-provoking as we did. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep pushing for a better world. We'll see you on the next deep dive.
Until next time.